let's get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Weaver. Welcome to Designers at Home. We have today Richard Manion. And Richard, thank you for joining us today. It's a thrill to have you on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's go into a little bit about your background, Richard. You originally grew up in Northwest Connecticut, yes?
Yes, yes.
And were you exposed as a young man to architecture, anything to do with architecture?
Well, there were a lot of wonderful colonial revival buildings or even houses and structures from the early 20th century back to the late 1700s, not far from my doorstep. And so there was that sense of history was always a great part of growing up in the Northeast.
And when did you discover that you wanted to be an architect? How did that happen?
Well, we were able to dig up an essay that I wrote when I was 10. We were asked in grade school to write what we thought we would want to be. And so as far back as then, I can trace my desire to be an architect. I don't know if it had to do with my parents buying me Legos and Lincoln Logs and sitting at home making structures, but it could all be tied together. It goes back quite far.
I played with the same things. I loved creating buildings with log sticks, Lincoln Logs, all of that. It was now you're a graduate of Columbia University. That's where you studied.
Yes.
And you studied under one of your professors was Robert A.M. Stern.
Yes, he was the director of the undergraduate program. I took a few art history classes with him, and he directed the design studio as well.
And how is it that you later on went to work for his firm? Was that by coincidence or what?
Well, I had a great interest in traditional architecture, and I studied both architecture and architectural history. And I wanted to apprentice at a firm whose work I respected, and I had a great dialogue with Bob Stern and admired his approach to history and its adaptation to contemporary living, and approached him one day, and he was thrilled to bring me on board. There was a lot of work in the firm. And at that time, it was primarily residential, which was
Yes.
my at least initial interest. And so the rest is history, as they say.
So you're also a member of the American Institute of Architects, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Los Angeles Conservancy, and the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. So is your work mostly influenced by traditional? You also do very contemporary architecture, though.
Yes, I would say that traditional architecture, whether it's very classical or formal or more vernacular and regional, is kind of the underpinning of our work, and adapting that to our current time, our clients' lifestyles, and a little bit of the zeitgeist is our general focus. And also modern styles that we appreciate for their history as well. We have to remember modernism goes back and really is 100 years old or so at this point in time. We're in a sort of to forgive the 80s phrase of a postmodern era, but a lot of that work is now considered us to be historical. And so we enjoy both our interpretation of high European modernism, how it can be adapted to either California or Hawaii or other locations, and how that can tie in with history at the same time.
So there's in one of your books, there was something that you said that I thought was very interesting. You said, "In the great tradition of architects before me, my work has evolved over time. I'm at heart an eclectic, drawing inspiration from history, travel, and imagination. And I guess I could have said the same thing because that resonated with me. So travel, you know, it's one of my favorite things to talk about is travel. Unfortunately, for the last couple of years, we haven't had the opportunity to travel at will like we used to. But has travel had a great influence on your work and how you see things?
Absolutely. I think firstly, you don't really experience either a culture in another location or its architecture, if that's what's driving you to travel, without being present in person. The experience of looking through books, well, and again, dating myself a bit, but in the era in which I grew up, you relied on books and or television, is very different than being there in person to see the environment, the scale, how people react to the buildings, what are the materials, the details, the finishes. That's all so different in person. Maybe that'll change with technology and be able to immerse yourself in the meta universe or the metaverse as it's being called. But I think that you just don't get the same depth of the culture and the environment without being there in person. And the journey is part of it. You know, you're traveling from your own environment to another location,
Experiencing another culture.
There may be so many different things you don't realize about that culture in terms of how you're supposed to, you know, behave, depending on the location too. So I found that and really experiencing them the very first time I ever went to Europe. I actually just walked through the city of Rome for about 4 days speechless. It was absorbing an endless amount of what one had studied.
That's the same thing that happened to me. One of my first trips to Europe was in Rome, and it was life-altering. It's also interesting to see over time how buildings age and how they hold up with regard to style. I know when you're bringing up Rome, probably I think my favorite building in the world is the Pantheon. It's one of the great buildings in Rome. And I first time I walked in there, I must have stayed for hours studying every little nuance, every little detail, the colors, the scale, everything. And another one of my favorite buildings, which is in northern Italy in the town of Pisano, is the Gypsoteca Canova. And it's a small little museum housing the works of Antonio Canova, the 18th century sculptor. And there's a classical part of the building, which is probably 17th to 18th century. And then there's a newer part of the building, 20th century, that was designed by the Italian architect Carlo Scarpa. And it's really fascinating to see these works, these classical works of sculpture in an 18th century building and a 20th century building, and to see how seamlessly these works work within the architecture. And those are two buildings that I just really absolutely adore. If you were to pick out a couple works of architecture that have influenced you, could you name them?
Yes, I've always enjoyed the villas of Andrea Palladio, and as well as his palazzi. Too numerous to mention. The Villa Rotunda would be a personal favorite as an iconic building, but I also really like the Villa Barbaro or the Villa Amo, the ones that kind of have a great synthesis of Roman classicism with the vernacular functioning of the farm, or or the country estate. And I also love his palazzi because of their adapting a Roman scale of architecture to the smaller environment of Vicenza. And he's one of my personal favorites. And as well as I really admire the work of Sir Edwin Lutyens and his adaptation of the English vernacular within a classical Palladian tradition too.
Yes. Great. So you've said your goal is to unite ideas about tradition, history, and modernity. And one of the things that you said, you've quoted Goethe, and I thought this was really poetic. You said, architecture is frozen music.
Yes, it's one of my
That's
favorite
absolutely
quotes.
wonderful.
Yes, yes. I first learned it from Frank Lloyd Wright, incidentally, but it kind of captures to me the essence. And one of my other passions is classical music, and it just says everything to me about a building. Is sort of the whole theme is just frozen in place, and it's a dancing composition of themes and ideas, and it's always been one of my favorites.
Yeah, it's a brilliant statement. So can we talk a little bit about your projects?
Sure.
Both past and present.
Yes.
I know I visited your website, which is really wonderful. And you have projects both domestically. You had a very interesting project, I believe, in Singapore. And how is it working? Do you prefer working domestically or internationally? Is it difficult?
Well, they're very different, of course, because domestically you can get to the project more quickly regardless of location.
Uh-huh.
And the construction methods are pretty uniform and standard, and you're used to the culture. Again, when you work internationally, there's a lot of factors involved. Typically, first you only do the design level drawings, and a local architectural firm creates the construction drawings and does the bulk of the construction administration, where they're overseeing the process. Most projects we've worked on overseas are also done in concrete framing, which is very different from what we're used to here. It's a little bit more cumbersome.
And why is that? Why is that?
Well, it's the members are heavier and more solid than ours. They're bulkier, so they do have a tendency to conflict with mechanical systems and ductwork quite a bit more. We've also found that depending on where you work overseas, the zoning can be either more restrictive or looser than we're used to. Right. For example, in certain countries it's highly regulated. In other countries, we don't have so many rules. But at the same time, I think because you're not doing the construction side, you do get to spend more of your time on the design side, which is quite fun.
Right.
So you're enjoying, I think, the more fun part of the process more when you work overseas. You do have to get used to the time changes and how that works with coordination, but they can be very rewarding. It's also interesting to see what do clients want overseas. And quite often the answer is they want what we're building here, not what they have as their own heritage. And so
they're interested in Western.
That seems to be the norm, in many of the locales we've worked. And sometimes we try to adapt local traditions, but in a place like Singapore, which is so eclectic, you're just as likely to see a classical structure as you are a contemporary one or a vernacular one.
Well, in the job in Singapore, you tell us a little bit about that project. That was interesting.
Well, in Singapore, there are very few large single-family properties, and so the land is hard to obtain. This was a sloping lot of almost 2 acres, which was fairly rare, where you approach from below, came around the side, and ended up at the top, so that the backyard could cascade down the hill to the view of the high rises in the distance. And the client wanted a very formal 18th century French house. And so, and we had to adapt it to materials and products that we could get there or in the general region of Asia. So we had to do research on the stone we could get, what the plaster work would be. They typically avoid woodwork because it doesn't do well with termites and local issues. So all the work on the interior became plaster. How was that going to be done? Doing the spiral, the house has a 3-story spiral stair. Doing that in concrete got very heavy, and steel was prohibitive. We had to adapt and work that detail out. So it was quite a lot of interesting, challenges to adapt that style to that climate.
And did the client come to you with a direction, a style direction?
She knew exactly what she wanted.
Which
Exactly.
was?
I admire the 18th century hotel particulars and chateau in and around the Paris region. So I had a very, very specific historical approach.
Oh, that's great. So tell us about some of your current work.
Well, we are working on an interesting Moroccan villa outside of Honolulu that is privileged to have the only private boat harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. And that is a challenge. It cascades a little bit like Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water, but in Moroccan form. We just completed a streamlined French home in the Bay Area that we're going to be photographing soon. We just completed a Cape Cod style house also in the Bay Area. We have a fun, we're working on a remodel and alterations to a landmark Edward Durrell stone house in Texas, which is quite fun and also a challenge.
Uh-huh.
And so we're
what are
thrilled.
some of the challenges on this project?
Well, part of it is, many of the components from it are either older or from another remodel. And our client and the interior designer have a different vision for aspects of the work while keeping the integrity of the project. It needs new doors and windows, and you know how thin those 50s and 60s sliding doors could be back in that time, not having to deal with current codes of energy usage and glazing. And those are sometimes difficult to replicate because we're having to accommodate new factors in zoning and building codes. So getting all of that coordinated, it's an existing structure from another time. We want new flooring. There's a real fun skylight lattice work that is so intricate and complicated. It's like a jewel box. Duplicating that in new materials is another challenge. So you find that a lot of it is you're trying to capture some of the original influence, bring it up to date, but you're executing it in either new materials or meeting different requirements,
right,
structurally, so forth. And so it's a balancing act, really.
So is this house a registered historical house?
It has a certain status, but it is Texas. So it's a different environment than say New York or Los Angeles in that regard.
Right.
You can do a lot more in Texas.
Okay, a little more freedom.
Yes.
So we have a couple people who want to discuss, they're putting up comments and they'd like to discuss your books. Now, you have 2 books that you've published. The first one is The New Classicist, Richard Manion Architecture. Do you have a copy of that there?
Yes.
Can we see it?
We did this back in 2010.
2010.
Yeah, as part of the series, we were invited. And, many of these houses, there are many that are quite historical in nature. And they combine basically either new construction or remodeling where we were making our stamp on largely traditional houses. We did, for example, even, our take on kind of a Mediterranean dining room.
Can you raise it up just a little bit, Richard? There. Beautiful.
It's a challenge when your traditional home is trying to keep somewhat authentic with the proportions and fenestration, the ratio of wall to window, but has a panoramic view. So that's a big challenge in Los Angeles. And we did also have a great deal of fun creating kind of Art Deco inspired new bathrooms for a Paul Williams house where the previous owner had gutted some of the spaces or changed the design. We're very enthusiastic about remodeling older houses, kind of bringing them up to date,
sure,
but keeping some of the traditions. This was a colonial revival house that we did in Bel Air that was inspired by a lot of the 1930s houses that are in Atlanta and on the East Coast. Los Angeles has a great tradition of the white painted brick, which is a great way to soften the Georgian or colonial revival homes. And so we took our inspiration for that one, as well as we had a client who allowed us to indulge a very ornate level of work with an interior designer that was a good friend of theirs, and do quite a wild Venetian style dining room. So we explored all of that in this book. And towards the end of the book, as we were getting later in time, closer to 2010, we started to include projects that were a little bit more streamlined, but this was an apartment we did with an interior designer in New York. And so we were kind of bridging that gap between tradition and modernism back then at the tail end. But the general theme of the book was to put our stamp on a number of traditional projects.
Right. Now, your second book, which just was, I believe, published last year, is called Streamlined, right?
Yes. This we had a delay of over COVID.
Whoop. Richard, can you hear me? I think we just lost your audio. Can you hear me?
Sorry, I can't hear you now.
There you are.
Oh, there.
We lost the audio for a moment. That's better.
Sorry about that.
So I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So we had the great honor of working on the remodel and expansion of a grand estate from the early 1960s that Henry Kaiser had outside of Honolulu. And the house became our interpretation of what mid-century should be in Hawaii. And so part of it was the idea of combining color into the architecture, but within a framework of design that was very high European modernism, that was the underpinnings of the original house. And because it's always important to me and my firm that whatever project we're working on have a relationship to both to today and its site and its history. And so that was quite fun. We also have explored a number of traditional houses where there's a great classical underpinning to the layout is formal, but the house itself and the details are becoming more streamlined, lighter. The use of metal windows, which and French doors, which was also very popular in Los Angeles, but largely in some of the Mediterranean work,
Yes.
has proven great for this type of construction.
It's a beautiful ceiling detail also.
Yes, yeah, that was an interpretation of the Old English strap work, but
Yes.
done very flat.
Uh-huh.
Very light and thin. So the new book has been how we've integrated a streamlining and a modernism into the work, whether the house is a new house and meant to be an interpretation, whether it's a remodel even of an older house that's brought more up to date, lighter, a little bolder, brighter, or whether it's a completely contemporary house and we're integrating the client's art and furnishings and lifestyle into our version of a modern house.
Yes.
And
so you know, it's designers and architects are always referencing through books, you know, past work, current work. And I think it's really important for people to look at what is being done. And your books are a perfect example. I mean, I encourage people watching the show today these are available on Amazon, I'm assuming, right?
Yes, Amazon.
Yeah,
and
these are great reference books. If you're interested in architecture, both classical and modern, because I'm constantly looking at your works of other architects, for influence and reference and things to show client. And yours are two really beautiful examples, Richard.
Thank you so much.
Now, let's talk a little bit about how technology has affected the way that you're currently working.
Well, technology is a challenge. I would say it's a challenge to integrate some of it, and it's also an opportunity. So, for example, much of the technology that we're integrating is electronic, and therefore more about wiring, keypads, and other components that come up with it. Sometimes people don't realize the little systems that have to hide in closets or basement rooms or mechanical rooms to accommodate these systems. But they're great opportunities for controlling lighting, the heating and air conditioning to different degrees. But we have that side kind of combined with codes related to energy conservation, water use, conservation, things that are more practical and related to the environment. So the challenge is these things are changing annually, and the technology is just evolving. So keeping on top of what's current is a challenge. It involves many times engaging consultants who really are, much more at the forefront than we. But following through with educational talks and lectures and meeting with people, that's a big part of what we have to do now. That's become an ever larger percentage of our time. And so the other challenge with it is then integrating it all aesthetically.
Yes.
So that's going to depend a bit on the nature of the project aesthetics.
Yes.
I'm sure you experienced that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I want to talk for a moment about Los Angeles architecture, since we're both residents here. And, I think my brother lives in San Francisco, and when he's visited before, he said, I just love Los Angeles, but it's such an architectural mess. Now, I'm going to quote something, because I now think differently about Los Angeles architect after reading this quote from you. You said, "Houses and gardens in all styles, in all sizes, in a range of quality and permanence came to exist comfortably next to one another. The Tudor manor, the French Regency cottage, the Spanish Swiss hacienda, an Indian Chinese bungalow, one right next to the other in a single block, manifested LA's bold spirit of acceptance and experimentation. The city, sprawling over 400 miles, was and still is the Wild West of urban design. And, you know, after reading that from you, I have a very different feeling about Los Angeles and its architecture, because it is the Wild West of urban design. And, you know, it's interesting because we are very accepting and willing to experiment here, unlike a lot of other cities.
Mm-hmm.
Would you,
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. Well, I mean, it's hard to think of a large city in the United States that grew up and brought people from all over the world in such a short period of time with the ability to create their own architecture. You know, New York, of course, having a longer heritage, but being a denser city, you know, single family homes are largely regulated to the fringe of the city or outside, but here they're in the city. And the city grew up, you know, around it by connecting all of these suburban areas. But people brought their dreams, their experiences. In some cases, they just brought the architecture they had from another location that you wouldn't think would have naturally sprouted up here, like a steeply pitched Tudor home where we don't have snow. But at the same time, and they embraced the original heritage of the Spanish colonial era, the Mission Revival era, and adapted all of that together while modernism was taking roots in the 20s. You had Frank Lloyd Wright doing his pre-Columbian inspired homes in town, and European modernists working here. They all brought their ideas and explorations, and they're often all on the same street or adjacent to one another.
Right.
And I think it creates a richness and a dialogue that is really unparalleled in the United States. And so there's less homogeneity, but there's more richness as a result. And I think it challenges you more to think about, you know, where did they come from? How did they do this? Why did they do that? What's great about it? What don't I like about it? But I think it provokes thinking and dialogue that makes it more interesting than if it was all, you know, uniform.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you. So can we take a peek into the world of Richard Manion? Can you tell us a little bit about how you live? And people love knowing with designers and architects how they choose to live, the style of their homes. And if you were to build a new house today, what would you build?
I would probably build a streamlined mid-century modern house, but with not keeping true to the period. I think, again, in my nature, being more eclectic, where I might combine a bit of Mies van der Rohe with Italian lighting from the 60s, with furniture that's probably a combination all the way from the 40s through the 70s, and probably fill it with my collection of California Impressionist art, which to me kind of ties the house to the area. And I'd probably remodel it every 3 years.
You sound like the typical decorator or architect. Yeah.
It's so much easier
evolving,
to design,
right?
for. It's so much easier to create a house for someone else.
It is. It's easy to be objective and finish a project.
Yeah.
Richard, it's such a treat to visit with you. I appreciate you taking the time to come on the show today. And I encourage everybody to research Richard's book. And we had several people making comments during our talk, Richard, and they said, I want Richard to sign a copy of the book for me. So you have fans out there.
Well, thank you so much. It's been great to spend
It's
time
fun.
with
Thank
you.
you, Richard. I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining today, everybody. In 2 weeks on December 17th, we're going to venture into the area of performing arts and education. We're going to be speaking with Sel Cardan, who is the CEO and president of the Colburn School of Performing Arts, which is located in downtown Los Angeles. So I hope you'll join us for that chat. It will be very, very interesting. And thank you for joining us today on Designers at Home. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.